It says I'm live, so I think we're live. Hey everyone. You can see Pete, the nugget of Pete, sleeping behind me this time. How's everyone doing today? Just gonna reorganize things a little bit on my screen here, and we're gonna give it another 5 minutes or so. Just kind of hang out and let people come in. I'm just kind of checking the socials. I'm gonna turn this light down a little bit. Checking the socials to kind of give people a chance to get here. Yeah, let me do this. Hey everyone. I'm also gonna share. I think I can do this. I'm going to share the link to the story that we're going to be discussing today in the chat. If you guys do want to take a quick look at it, it's right here. That should be the right link. Pete is, you can't really see him past the, what's it called? The armrest. He's kind of snoozing over there. He might snooze through this entire thing. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if I can like wake him up and get him to come hang out and like, I don't know, be right here, because that's what he usually does. It's like he's always in my face on my desk until I want him to be, and then he just disappears. So that's fun. All right, just making sure we got everything organized over here. See if there's anything on the Twitters. Is everyone doing all right? Everyone's hanging in there, literally in there inside. Oh, Jeff, I'm glad you're reading the book. I hope you're enjoying it. I feel like I should just sit here like this for the few minutes while people come in. Ta-da! Let's see if I can actually get one more book over here. See if we can figure this thing out. There. Now it's blatant product placement o'clock. I like it. Okay. All right, it's been a couple minutes. I'm seeing we've got a good number of people here, so that's good. Okay. I think we're good. I'm going to close the things that are going to eat up my eat up all of my bandwidth, because we know that my internet is not great. This is not okay. We'll just do this. Oh, you know what? I have this one on my desk, so we'll talk about this super quick while we wait for a few more people to come in. This is my first book. If those of you who don't know that I actually did write 2 books. So this is my first book, Breaking the Chains of Gravity. It's got that old book smell already, which leads me to believe it's just been in a box somewhere and I unearthed it recently. It's about the story of spaceflight before NASA. So it's kind of looking at all of the things that existed in America at the time of NASA's creation and how they all came into the space agency that we know and many of us love. It's very different in terms of writing style and also length from Fighting for Space, which is, of course, my new book and what we're going to be talking about a bit today, which is the true story of the true story of 2 female pilots. And they're flying and working at a time when America was taking its first steps into space. You may know it as story of the Mercury 13. Of course, we've talked about this before as well. I will throw the link to that article up in this chat if you guys want to take a look at it. But I think we're just about, it's been almost 4 minutes. I'm going to grab a tiny bit of water here, and then I think we are just going to dive on into the weird Jerrie Cobb when they talk about Jerrie Cobb. Philip, well, thank you for stopping by. Hello, and yes, I understand people needing to go back to work. If you do want to listen to this later, it will be available, of course, archived on my YouTube channel instantly as soon as we're done today. So, yay. Okay. All right. Hydration is important. All right, so we're gonna dive on in here. So I've shared a couple links in the chat for you guys. It's also up on my Twitter, of course. Today we are going to be discussing Jerrie Cobb, who is, of course, this woman down here on the cover of my new book. And I'm just gonna go over a little bit of Jerrie's backstories. I know most of you guys probably know who she is, but just in case anybody out there doesn't, I don't want to kind of get into this weird, like, hidden love triangle with no context. So why are we talking about Jerrie Cobb in the first place? Well, Jerrie Cobb is probably who a lot of you guys know as associated with the name Mercury 13. And I use air quotes because that is such a poor title for this group. So the Mercury 13, the typical story, I should say, is 13 women, female pilots, took the medical astronaut tests that the Mercury astronauts were given in the 1950s. They took it in 1960, 1961, and believed that they were qualified for spaceflight. Therefore, they took on NASA in this bid to have women be admitted into the astronaut corps in the 1960s. And their leader was Jerrie Cobb. And she purported herself in the media as the first woman to take the tests, to have done the simulation training, to have done everything that the male astronauts had done. Only in reality, she hadn't. Her testing was done as a private pilot program, and we're going to be discussing this in a future stream, but she was in no way qualified to fly in space. So when most people hear the name Jerrie Cobb, they think Mercury 13, they think first woman to be trained as an astronaut in the United States. And indeed, when Jerrie Cobb died, she actually died last year, and her obituaries all had something to say about her being the first female astronaut in America. And none of that is true. And that's largely what my book is about. It's kind of unpacking that story. Taking Jerrie out of the role of the hero and showing that it's actually typically the villain in the story is Jackie Cochran, who's this woman right here, that it's actually Jackie's story because Jackie knew everybody and was far more involved in everything going on than Jerrie. So in the book, one thing I really wanted to do was humanize both of the women. So the book is really presented, for those of you who haven't seen me talking about it or read it yet, it's presented as a dual biography of Jackie and Jerrie, which is why they're both on the cover of the book, so that you have an understanding of where both of them are coming from, such that when we get to the kind of climax of the story, which is this congressional subcommittee hearing on the qualifications of astronauts and whether women should be admitted into the astronaut program, that when we get there, we understand why Jerrie was not in the right arguing in favor of female spaceflight, and why Jackie actually had some rationale behind her when she said women shouldn't be jumping into space right away. So a lot of the book is kind of not explaining, because it's really written, I tried to write it in a way that draws you in like a work of fiction, even though there are 40 pages of references in here. There's something like 1,300 footnotes that we had to cut out because it was like, I had footnotes that were a page long. It was ridiculous. But I wanted to kind of tease out both women's early lives because I wanted you to understand them as pilots and as women and as people, to understand their motivations. And in the case of Jerrie, there's a really interesting part of her story that is about her big romance with Jack Ford, who is her boss. Now, unfortunately, I don't believe I can actually share I don't think I can actually share my screen to show you guys pictures. So if you do have that article handy, I would pull it up and get a look at who we're talking about, because I don't think I can share images in the live stream, which is unfortunate because it'd be great to illustrate. Anyways, I digress. So Jerrie, I've got some visual aids. Jerrie wrote 2 memoirs. The first, Woman into Space, came out in 1963. This was the one that she wrote this was kind of her last-ditch effort to get NASA to fast-track a female spaceflight. She wrote it right after the congressional subcommittee hearing, and it was really her attempt to gain more popular support and hope that public outcry would help convince NASA that she deserved a shot into space immediately. Her second memoir, called Solo Pilot, it was written in 1997, and it's more about the stuff that didn't make it into Woman into Space. So, like I said, because this book was written to curry the favor of the public, it's very much geared towards her whole goal of going into space. Everything. I mean, she opens with the pedaling the stationary bicycle, as part of her medical testing at the Lovelace Clinic. And everything she talks about, she relates it to spaceflight. everything. Her first flight, she felt like the sky was her home, that she was drawn to the clouds. She had this inexorable pull to the great unknown. And there's a lot of language that really says it was written in a way to try to push the spaceflight agenda. This book is written much later, more about her flying adventures, and does go into more of her post-astronaut training life, which, of course, this book, the first one, didn't get into because she had not lived it yet. So it talks a lot more about her work as a missionary pilot in South America, and kind of what her post-NASA life was like. Her post would-be NASA life, I should say. Her post dealing with NASA life. So one thing both of these books have in common is they both have this very, very important, very big story arc involving a man named Jack Ford. And one of my biggest frustrations in writing Fighting for Space and trying to tease out this relationship with Jack Ford is not a very distinctive name. It is so hard to search for Jack Ford and not find a Jack for Ford trucks. So a lot of stuff, it was really hard to kind of piece this together a bit. And some things I kind of heard reference to or knew little bits about, but like still have not been able to find firm evidence of things that are part of Jack Ford's story. So a lot of what I did in the book, and a lot of it is, well, I'll do it this way. A lot of what I did in the book is coming right from Jerrie's memoirs in terms of what that romance with Jack was like and what it meant to her. And I ultimately wanted to leave it as Jerrie saw it, because she writes about it in a way that makes it so important for her personality and her development as a person and as a woman. And I really needed the reader to feel that and understand that. So a lot of the romance that I have in Fighting for Space is very much Jerrie's retelling of that epic romance. And it's epic by all accounts. So we'll go through it just a little bit. So Jerrie, we've talked about Jerrie in previous things, and I've written about her, so we know a little bit about her. Her upbringing, she learned to fly in the 1940s as a teenager. Her dad got a plane and got his pilot's license because he wanted to fly in the war, and got a small plane, a little it wasn't an air transport trainer. It was a Taylorcraft. Got a little Taylorcraft so that he could rack up hours and practice. And because her dad had a plane, Jerrie went up with him, and she fell in love with flying, and she started taking informal lessons with her dad right away. So Jerrie starts flying at 12. She's kind of grown up in this world of aviation. And that meant that she was, one of those people who, much like Neil Armstrong, probably got her pilot's license before she got a driver's license. She got her pilot license on her 16th birthday, which is the first day you can possibly get it. It was the time. I'm not sure about modern licensing dates. So I'm reasonably sure she doesn't talk about driving in any of her memoirs. I feel like she probably could fly before she could drive. So for her, flying was part of her life. She played professional, or not professional, but like local, I don't know the different levels of sports because I don't sports, but she played softball for a couple of years to earn enough money to continue her flying lessons and to actually, pay for renting a plane and paying for gas. She ultimately put herself into hock to a team, the Sooner Queens. This was the era when women's softball was, by the way, very, very much on vogue, very much a spectator sport, and was quite popular. She put herself into hock to this team for enough money to buy a little Waco, I think it was a Taylorcraft. I think it was another Taylorcraft that she saw on the road when she was touring with this softball team. So from that point on, aside from this like little weird summer when she was playing professional softball, Jerrie was always a pilot. That was how she made a living, which was pretty rare at the time for a woman. It was not unheard of, but it wasn't super common. The problem for Jerrie, she's born in 1931, so she's, looking for jobs in the early 1950s. She's 20. She does not have wartime experience. Her wartime experience is flying with her dad. Doesn't have combat experience. So all of the people who are applying for aviation jobs are all these men who've flown incredible aircraft overseas in combat. Or you have the woman who, A, is a woman, which is working against her as a pilot in the 1950s, and and who doesn't have the experience or the hours racked up that the male pilots have. So Jerry's struggling to find a job, and she's actually hired by an airline as a pilot, and then the airline folds before any planes actually get in. They got a DC-3. She flew it once, and then it folded. So the job she was able to get that was close to airplanes was for a company called Aerodex, and her job was to process work orders on those airplanes. And she tells the story. So all of this is, she tells the story that one day she was walking through the adjacent hangar at the Aerodex office, just looking at the planes that she loved, and this tornado of a man comes in, yelling, demanding someone help him because what is going on that he can't get a single person to help him repair his plane because he's losing money. Well, this man turns out to be Jack Ford, and he runs an aircraft ferrying company, and this company called Fleetway flies used military training planes to South American and Asian nations to help them build up their aircraft, and sometimes ferries new aircraft to nations around the world to help them fill out the roster for their airlines. Jack that morning was so mad because he had this plane sitting on the runway that needed repairs, and the longer it sat there, the more money he lost on this particular job. So Jerrie describes this tornado coming in of rage, and then she processes his work order and then goes to work, and then a few hours later, he comes back clean-shaven and suddenly handsome and asks to buy her an iced tea as a way of saying thank you. And over the course of their subsequent conversation, he talks about the company and talks about how so many pilots are afraid to fly single-engine trainers over water because, and Jerrie guesses it, right, your engine goes out, you don't have another one, and then you are going swimming. So she reveals that she's a pilot, and before she loses her nerve, volunteers to fly whatever planes Jack Ford needs to fly. A week later, he hires her. And by Jerry's retelling, he's kind of grudgingly bringing this woman on board. He doesn't really think she's going to be much good. When they go on their first trip together down to Peru, the whole thing is just an absolute mess. She can't fly formation. She lands before him. He ends up actually damaging his plane, and she has to fly alone. First time she's ever flown out of the country. She's never been to South America. She goes alone, and she ends up in prison in Ecuador for, depending on which book you read, 13 days or 2 days imprisoned in Ecuador. And finally, she's released. Jack Ford finagles getting her free and puts her in charge of all South American ferrying operations. So she's telling the story, and she's got this charmed job. She sort of didn't sweet talk her way into it, but she was, in a moment of boldness, put herself forward and took a risk, and it paid off. And as she's flying and she's doing more and more work with Jack, they're becoming closer, they're becoming friends. And she describes him as being so handsome, and the company Fleetway was based in Burbank, California, where it's close to Hollywood. He could have any woman he wanted, any movie star he wanted. So she can't believe it one day when they're flying over, I forget the body of water. I have to start remembering to look these things up beforehand. Oh, I have it in this article. So lo and behold, one day they are flying over the Gulf of Mexico on their way to Peru for another South American flight. When she blows a prop seal, oil starts spewing out of her engine. She can't see. She can't do anything. She's probably going into the ocean to die. And Jack says to her, "I can't lose you now because I love you," or something along those lines. And then Jerrie just describes it as this. I mean, it sounds like it's out of a movie. She's in this life or death situation. Her boss tells her that he loves her. And now all of a sudden, she's just being guided down to a safe landing, a gliding landing in Jamaica through magic because she has the power of love. And it's just this epic scene. She lands, she's covered in oil, she's crying, and she's sitting there with the canopy closed in her airplane, and she feels the weight of Jack Ford climbing up on the wing, and hears a smash as he slips in the oil and bangs into the canopy and rips it open, reaches in, pulls her out. She's this petite little woman. He's a big, strong man, and he kisses her right there on the tarmac and, wipes away a tear and leaves a smudge of oil in its place. And it sounds like it's right out of a movie. And the whole romance is this epic thing from that point on, because they're ferrying and they're flying, and they're having, their dinner dates are in Paris. They go out to play golf in Scotland. When they have a day at the beach, it's in Jamaica. And he's still being kind of the perfect man and making a point to come home and visit with her family in Ponca City, Oklahoma. The whole thing just sounds like this perfect storybook romance. And it starts to fall apart for Jerry's retelling, when she wants to marry him and he starts questioning why she would want to get married when married life is routine and drudgery and it's not fun and exciting. That, he effectively, to use the airplane terminology that they do, he wants to be ferrying and have a schedule that's all over the world all the time. And she wants the routine of having a home base at an airport where she's making smaller flights around the country. And they can't agree. And she tells it that that's what drew them apart, that they couldn't agree. They couldn't find a happy medium. She finally left the company, broke up with him, and he called her for a year before the calls finally stopped. And then 2 years later, he was killed in a plane crash. And then she describes it. And why I think it's so important to have the story in the book, she describes it as her first love being taken away from her, and uses that to say that her second love, her dream of flying in space, was taken away from her when NASA wouldn't let her fly. So it's a really important story in terms of understanding the loss Jerrie felt, because of how important it was to her, how much she put her one true love. And remember, she's 22 or 23 at the time, and that's things matter a lot more when you're 20, in your early 20s. She put that on par with not being able to fly in space, and it makes her case in this book so much stronger. And it's interesting that she wrote this whole story and wrote this whole epic romance. It's a little bit dodgy that she's openly admitting to having a relationship with her boss too, which is not, I don't know. I feel like we've seen Mad Men. It happens. That's a little bit dodgy to openly admit when you're trying to be America's sweetheart and convince the public that you are the perfect all-American woman that needs to be the first woman to go into space, to openly admit that you're having a relationship with your boss. The book was published in 1963 and Jack Ford died in 1959. So he was not around to confirm or deny the nature of their relationship or the extent of it or how long or what they did. Interestingly, and I found this out later, and I mention it in the author's note because it's been so hard to track down any details of this, even now. The other thing Jerrie never mentioned is that Jack Ford was married when they were having this affair, which to me is just a whole other level of like, what are you doing? How are you trying to present yourself as the perfect all-American girl when you just wrote a book, a large part of which is about you having an affair with your married boss, whose wife may or may not have had a child while you were dating, which is all kinds of weird. So let's talk about Mary Zerbel Hooper Ford, who, by the way, has an amazing name. So to talk about Mary Ford, again, tough name to Google. I'll tell you guys a little bit about how this all actually came up. We'll do it this way instead of just the kind of straight discussion way. I went to see a play about Jerrie and Jackie that made a very quick mention to Jack Ford being married. And in everything that I found and everything that Jerrie wrote, I hadn't seen it, and I tried to find some evidence of it. And it took a really long time and a lot of digging. But I couldn't find anything that was like super verifiable about the dates of his marriage, the nature, and I still haven't been able to find anything about the nature of his marriage, whether it was a good marriage, whether they were separated. So it's really, really hard to say anything definitive, which is why I left it in the book as in the author's note saying that there's evidence he was actually married. So take Jerrie with a grain of salt. And we're going to discuss that in a little bit. So what I do know is that he did marry this woman, Mary Zerbel Hooper Ford. So Mary, Mary is a little bit older than Jerrie. When Jerrie was just beginning to learn how to fly, Mary was flying overseas in England with the Air Transport Auxiliary of the Royal Air Force, which I don't know if it's the ATA or the ATA, but we're going to call them ATA because that's how it sounds in my head. So the ATA or the ATA was this unit flying with the Royal Air Force in England, made up of all the people who were not fit enough to fly for the Royal Air Force. So basically, this is pilots who were colorblind, which you can't be a fighter pilot if you're colorblind, who maybe didn't have one eye, who had an amputation, or if you were a woman, because women did not have flight status with the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. The goal of the ATA was to have all of these perfectly able but somehow unfit pilots flying missions at home such that the most able-bodied men who were needed to be flying combat roles would be freed to fly combat roles. Jackie Cochran, who we've talked about a little bit, won't get into her whole backstory because I've got other videos about her. But Jackie Cochran, one of her earliest wartime assignments was to go over and look at what the ATA was doing, specifically with women. She had this plan already and had presented it to Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady at the time, of deploying or employing women, rather, to fly missions at home in the US such that all of the men that were needed to be flying combat missions would be free to go over to Europe. Now, at the time that Jackie started bringing up this idea and formulating her plan, America wasn't at war, so there was nothing to do with it. But it was sufficiently interesting to President Roosevelt, and as 1941 wore on, it became clear that America was, if not going to enter the war, at least start supporting the Allies more in the war. So Jackie was assigned to go overseas with a small group of American women to fly with the ATA girls. And her goal was not only to help the British forces for a time, but to learn how everything was working such that she could replicate the program or kind of do her own version of it at home if and when American women were needed to fly for their country. So Jackie went over in the summer of 1942. Yes, the sort of early, spring, summer 1942, with a group of 25 women. Among them was a young woman named Mary Zerbel. Now, Mary had learned to fly with the civilian pilot training program at the University of California in Los Angeles, and had heard about the ATA program, both the ATA program generally, as well as the fact that it employed women, because her fiance, Roy Wesley Hooper, was serving with the Royal Air Force Coastal Command in England and was deployed overseas. She knew that there was a chance for women to fly with the ATA girls and tried to get a wartime assignment, tried to get over there mainly to be with her fiance, but couldn't do it because there was no need and she couldn't get an emergency passport. Well, of course, that changed after Pearl Harbor, and Jackie started recruiting women to fly with the ATA girls. Jackie personally interviewed Mary at her ranch, the Cochran Odlum Ranch in Indio, California, and hired her. So Mary became one of the first 25 American women to fly overseas as part of the war effort. Now, Mary describes her life in England as strange, but not really that different from her normal life because she wasn't on any front lines, and she admits that she was 21 in 1942 and felt invincible. Like, you hear air raid sirens, but they're not common enough to be scary. You hear about pilots going down in planes, but she never had any massive issues herself. And bonus, she got to get married finally. There is a picture in that article that I wish I could share with you on the screen, but Jackie was present at the wedding of Mary Zerbel and Roy Wesley Hooper. So Mary's life is pretty charmed in England up until Roy disappears. In October of 1942, he went out with an RAF Coastal Command team in a Lockheed Hudson. It was a routine mission, but the plane disappeared, and no one was ever able to find any of the crew, either alive or dead, nor any parts of the presumed wreckage. So he disappeared in action, and 9 months later was declared dead. Mary stayed in England because she had a pretty decent job in spite of the personal loss she'd experienced. She had a pretty decent situation as a ferry pilot. Talking about on a later date. She was still working in England and she was still meeting other pilots. And this is where she met Jack Ford. Jack Ford was an Army Air Force heavy bombardment pilot stationed in East Anglia while she was stationed in Ratcliffe. And they married just 15 months after Roy's disappearance. The two of them stayed together and stayed in the world of flying when they returned to the United States after the war. They together started the company called Fleetway, based out of Burbank, which means when Jerry's talking about having an affair with her boss, she's working for Jack Ford and she's also working for his wife, Mary, which is really weird. So this company, like I said, was ferrying all these airplanes all over the world. It's unclear, and I'm still trying to track stuff down. I will be updating this article if I am able to find more things, but I know they were flying planes to nations including Peru, Paraguay, China, Korea, and Brazil, supporting air forces and supporting commercial aviation endeavors. I don't know how often Mary was out flying, how often she and Jack were flying together, but it's clear from Jerry's memoir, if we can trust what Jerry's writing, that Jack was flying quite a bit on his own and was able to finagle his way to cross paths with Jerry. Now, I said earlier that Jerry's version of the story sounds like it should basically be a Hollywood movie. Well, I just feel like the story gets so much weirder because Jack and Mary Ford were at least the partial inspiration for the 1958 movie The Lady Takes a Flyer, starring Lana Turner and Jeff Chandler. So, Lana Turner is effectively the Mary Ford character, and Jeff Chandler is effectively the Jack Ford character. The names, of course, have been changed. Maggie Colby is Mary Ford in the movie, and Mike Dandridge, weird name, Mike Dandridge, I'm going to trip over that, is the movie version of Jack Ford. So the plot of the movie is just, it's so obvious. It's obviously because it's inspired by their life and their romance, but it's weird. So Mike Dandridge in the movie goes into business ferrying airplanes with his flight school buddy, Al Reynolds, who is played by Richard Denning. In the course of his work, he ends up meeting fellow pilot Maggie Colby, the Mary Ford character, and Mike and Maggie end up falling into a romantic arrangement during a cargo trip flying out to Japan. They fall in love, they get married, and conflict comes when Mike hires a young pilot named Nikki, played in the movie by Andra Martin, to as the newest pilot to the company. And the plot hints that Mike has an affair with Nikki while Maggie is at home raising their baby, which sounds a lot like Jack having an affair with Jerry while Mary is home raising their baby. So I know that Mary in her later life lived with oh wait, we should do this part first. Okay, so we talked about how Jack Ford's death was like Jerry losing her first love, and it was a huge turning point for Jerry. Well, it was also a huge turning point for Mary. She's lost her second husband to an aircraft accident, and her business partner. I mean, this is her life, is this man, and he dies in a plane crash in 1959. He was flying a Beech E-18 out of Wake Island on a routine trip. When Jerry describes Jack's death, she has already gotten herself out of this depression that she felt after they broke up. And in the late 1959, she's starting to make a name for herself as a record-setting pilot. For Mary, it drove her away from flying, at least professionally. I haven't been able to verify that she never flew again, just small flights in a little her own personal plane off her own property or something, but she completely shifted careers. She took the insurance money and began pursuing a teaching credential, but hated it. So instead earned a master's degree in library science and ended up working as a librarian for the military. She traveled to California, New York, Ohio, and eventually Germany, where she spent the better part of the 1970s and 1980s until she retired until 1984. She had to work a decent amount throughout her retirement because she didn't have a great stipend as a military librarian. And I also know that she lived with her daughter. For the most part, her daughter who had some health problems. Mary describes it as an acute respiratory issue that pollution could actually play on her central nervous system. And if she was in a bad situation, just living in Los Angeles would be considered a bad situation, that such unclean air could actually cause her temporary paralysis. So between needing to work in retirement and taking care of her daughter, Mary lived with her daughter in various parts of the country, trying to find clean air until her death in September of 2012. It's not clear. I haven't found anything to say that the daughter that Mary was living with in her retirement was her daughter by Jack. It feels like the dates would line up like that. She didn't. I don't think she would have had a child. She probably would have tried to avoid having a child while serving overseas in the war. And they weren't, she and Roy weren't married super long, so might not have had a chance to become pregnant. It's likely that it was Jack, could have been from someone else after Jack's death. And like I said, I haven't been able to find anything to really speak to the status of their marriage, whether it was happy, whether they were separated. Maybe they were separated considering divorce when he had this affair with Jerrie and he died before they were able to actually go through with it. There's a whole lot of speculation about the real nature of their relationship and kind of how Jerrie fits into the whole thing. But I wanted to talk before I go to some questions, and let's see if we actually do have questions. Oh, good. We have some questions coming in. Awesome. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about why I even knowing that the whole relationship story is quite dubious from Jerrie's perspective, why I still thought it was really important to put it in this book. Because there's two reasons. So we talked a little bit about the importance of having you understand the importance of this relationship because it meant so much to her. And if it meant so much to Jerrie, I needed you to know it because it clearly impacts the way she behaves and how strongly she goes after her goal of becoming the first woman to fly in space. So that was part of it. But putting the romance in and introducing this potential nugget of untruthness, that's not a real word, kind of putting in this little bit to question it in the author's note, which is why I'm like really hoping people read the author's note in this thing. Putting this little question of whether or not she was honest, whether Jack was honest. I mean, I think it's unlikely, but possible that she just didn't know that they were married and thought they just worked together. Again, if they were considering divorce, they might not be close in the office. Because it's an interesting thing that if Jerrie lied about that, or if she kind of told a version, the Jerrie version is what I call it. If she told the Jerrie version of this epic romance, what else might she be telling the Jerrie version of? So it's an interesting thing to see like how much a big romance story arc humanizes her, but ultimately calls into question so many things that she does. She puts herself forward. She'll say, she doesn't want to be the martyr. She doesn't want to be the poster child. She doesn't want to be, the one known for fighting for women's space flight. But she is that person, and she did cultivate that image. So either she lied about the epic romance to make herself feel more, to make people more sympathetic to her cause, or she lied about Jack being married to further the image that she was just the good all-American girl who could do no wrong, because having an affair with a married man for like 2 years, by the way, like 2 years when you're also working for the woman is calls a lot more for her actions into question. So I think it's a really interesting part of the story, and it's again why the author's note in this book is quite important. But it's such an interesting thing, and I'm glad I've been able to dig up some stuff about Mary Ford. Although details are still scarce, so I'm gonna keep looking. Once I'm able to go to museums again, I've found where some of her archives are, and I will go to them just as soon as I am able to drive to another city and speak to a human and be in the same room as another human. So yeah, this will be, I'll let you guys know if there is an update to this story, but I think it's such an interesting facet and something that's just like too speculative to have put in here, but still very interesting and very much worth discussing. Okay, so we are gonna look, I've been talking for a while today. Okay, we're gonna look at questions and see